Welcome. You're watching Change the World, and I'm your host, Guy Dauncey. And as you'll know, if you've seen the show before, I like to invite guests on who share my passion for building a better world and for bringing kindness, compassion, and cooperation to our world. For my goodness, we need it. My guest today is Eli Enns, who's come in from the Tofino area. And I'm fascinated by the project you've set up, Tla-o-qui-aht Nation. But first of all, tell me about your family background and your where you come from as a person.
Sure thing. Yeah, so I'm born here in Victoria, but my late father was from Mears Island, the village of Tla-o-qui-aht, an ancient village site there on Mears Island, known in New Channel as Wanajus Hilthuis. My mother was born in St. Boniface, Winnipeg, Manitoba. She grew up on a farm outside of McGregor, mainly, and then in the 1970s, following her siblings, her older siblings, came out to the West, and this whole hippie, kind of flower child movement, and so that's how I came to be. The coming together of those two cultures. One side obviously blonde hair, blue eyes on my Dutch Mennonite side, and then my New Channel ancestry. Folks who look maybe more like me with a darker hair.
And on your father's side, we're talking 5,000 years, 10,000 years of occupation.
Our history goes back. We have stories from prior to the Ice Age.
Oh wow! Yes, then we're talking 15,000, 20,000 years ago.
Very
then.
Deep history on Vancouver Island, and New Channel peoples have been. We've been around for a long time.
So, Tla-o-qui-aht Nation, when I looked into what you were doing and I saw the breadth of the programming you're doing, I was pretty amazed. But I want you to explain the two words, Tla-o-qui-aht and Olam, because they're very deep, right?
Yeah. Tla-o-qui-aht is a New Channel word that loosely translates to meaning respect, but a more nuanced understanding is to observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. And one kind of shortcut of understanding this is like biomimicry in social innovation. So to observe nature, how Mother Nature does things, and then to try to mimic that in the way that we design social institutions and processes. So Tla-o-qui-aht is our highest law in the New Channel Constitution.
And is that widely shared among New Channel people?
All
up the coast?
Yeah, respect being the number one law, and Tla-o-qui-aht, and represented by the sun and moon crest. Because of course the sun...
That would be on the totem pole?
On the totem pole, and the totem pole is our constitution.
Right,
And so the sun and moon are the big governors. And so to always be aware of what's happening with the sun and the moon, and then to organize your day, organize your activities based on that. And
so let me ask, before we get to Olam, I've got this funny question in my mind, that when a totem pole wears out after 200-300 years, do you have to rewrite your constitution?
Well, good question. It's funny how things can live on, even though. So there's a story about the first cedar man of first contact with Europeans, and he was stood up based on a dialogue that happened among New Channel leadership. And these Europeans came and said, "What should we do with these guys? They need us. They have some interesting technology. Maybe we could create."
But they can't feed themselves.
That's right. The reciprocity, scurvy as well, and all kinds of stuff. So everyone said, well, we're fine. Let's just see where this goes. Let's have a relationship with them, trade with them. We don't have to kill them all. But there was one dissenting voice, and that dissenting voice, he had a terrible dream about the newcomers, and he dreamt that they would eat everything, and that they would be insatiable, that they would eat the forests, they would eat the mountains.
And this is before the fella bunch of machines.
That's right. And they would even eat the sky. And people thought, how can you eat the sky? How can you eat
it's called
mountains?
Carbon dioxide emissions.
And so to honor this dissenting voice, they erected a cedar man in a harbor at Panitla, as I've been told by people wiser than me. And this story of first contact was recorded in that artifact. Right. And so generation after generation of children and young people would be brought there. Cedar Man was standing, they would tell the story of this
Yes.
This dialogue that happened. And even long after the cedar man went back into the earth,
yes.
the cedar man still stood there, metaphorically.
Yes.
And so, you know, you can almost see it when you go there, right?
Wow.
Because you've been told these stories.
Wow,
And so in a way, that's how it becomes immortal. We don't have to, you know, rig up steel rebar and concrete and try to build something that's going to last forever.
Right,
it's really silly.
Yeah.
We can articulate the world through story, and that's what. So, long way of answering your question about the totem.
So that's Isak. Now tell me about Olam.
Olam comes from also an ancient source of knowledge, and it comes from an old Hebrew expression, tikkun olam. And tikkun olam, as it was described to me, is sort of a gauge of decision making. Will this improve the world, or will this not improve the world?
Right.
Should I do this, or should I not do this? And what I love about this approach to tikkun olam is that will this harm the world isn't even part of your choices. Right. Will it improve the world, or will it not improve the world?
Right.
Not will this destroy the world. And it was just outside of the cultural paradigm. So tikkun olam is this inescapable, eternal responsibility to improve the world.
And the paradox of this is, personally, I'm doing a whole bunch of work on economics.
Yeah.
And in standard neoclassical economics and capitalist thinking, you make your profit and stuff like that. Everything else is an externality. Right. So the question of whether you harm or do anything else to the world, not even considered.
Right.
Yeah. Just off the radar.
Yeah,
the only thing that matters is, will I make money? It's the cedar man's dream.
Pretty insane, yeah. Yeah, I hear you. No, it is insane.
Yeah. So you set up Isak Olam as a foundation, right?
Yep.
Or how did that all begin? And
well,
it's a big undertaking.
Yeah, I had the benefit of, I had a university education in political science, and I focused on geopolitics. I'm very interested in geopolitical evolution of nation states and how that all came about. But also, particularly in Canada, looking at constitutional law. So constitutional law, international dispute resolution, and geopolitics were the areas that I looked at there. However, I also was the beneficiary of Hahopa, which is an old kind of neutronal system of education, of medicining with thought and ideas. Wow. And I kind of caught the tail end of some of our last really epic elders that we had on the West Coast, and I think I kind of intuitively knew that their knowledge was extremely valuable, and so I asked a lot of questions.
Yes.
And we still have some elders left today, but it's greatly
Is this
reduced.
like with the elders being in the lodge for 3 weeks and going into a retreat in the mountains and that kind of thing?
Or? Maybe not so much regularly. Just go knock on someone's door and have a kitchen conversation, or they come by the office and
would you be
questions.
invited to have those conversations, or can anyone knock on the door and talk to them?
Well, anyone can ask questions. I started off with this funny little, I think it was called the Native Studies program at Brandon University. Late Sam Corrigan had a journal that he oversaw for years, and I got a small grant to learn about secondary language acquisition within my community, and that's how I kind of got started. I think it was $1,000 or something, but it got me started talking to the elders, and so Hahopa, this old education system, it starts with things like Isak, and it goes to Hishuk-ish-tsawak. Everything is one and everything is interconnected.
Which is a really profound ecological concept.
Yes, yeah. Quantum physicists are just catching up with some of this stuff.
Yes.
Quay-Quixup is one that's lesser discussed. People talk about Hishuk-ish-tsawak.
Well, the mother tree concept that Suzanne Simard is doing, like in the forest.
That Hishuk-ish-tsawak is the interconnection of all things. Quay-Quixup.
Hishuk-ish-tsawak.
Hishuk-ish-tsawak. We'll nail it next.
Hishuk-ish-tsawak. Yes.
Hishuk-ish-tsawak, yeah. But then Quay-Quixup is the temporal equivalency, where everything is in a constant state of transformation.
Yes.
And it reminded me of Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And at the quantum physical level, we think of this as a solid and that as a liquid.
Until you get the microscope and dig in, right?
Yeah, when you get right down to it, it's just energy in relationship with energy.
Yes.
And by the way, it changes before you can fully observe it.
Yes.
And this is interesting.
Which brings consciousness into the picture, but we're getting way off track with this stuff. I'll make sure we have time to talk about your work with
so these kind of worldview concepts are key, and then there's relational concepts. But all this knowledge was handed over to me, gifted to me, with the understanding that I would do something in the world positively with it.
Right. Yes.
There's this moral ethic in Nuu-chah-nulth culture, which is that if you meet somebody who's starving, they won't be their best self in the world. They may act destructively to others and to themselves.
Yes.
And if I have surplus goods, I have a moral and natural law, I have a legal responsibility to share that surplus goods with the person who's starving. And the same thing goes with teachings. If you meet somebody who is deprived, who doesn't have those foundational teachings on how to be in the world in a good way, we think of it as a malnutrition of thought. Yes. And that if you have surplus teachings that might help that person who's starving, then I have a moral and a natural law, legal responsibility to share.
So one of the things in my work is the role of self-importance leading to selfishness and domination as being one of the bugbears that messes our lives up.
Okay.
But what I'm getting from what you're saying is if someone is full of self-importance, they're not hearing
That's right.
There's other teachings you're saying, so they're deprived of those nutrients.
Yeah, there might have been something happened in their childhood.
Yes.
Maybe it was in the childhood of their grandparents.
Or they got spoiled when they were 2 years old.
Yeah. So anyways,
do you have children, by the way?
I do. Yeah, I have 7 children.
Oh,
I have 4 daughters and 3 sons.
You've been through the entire child-raising firestorm, right?
Not a perfect dad. I became a dad at a young age, and now I'm a grandfather. My oldest daughter is turning 30, and she's blessed us with 3 children.
Wow, okay.
She started at the proper age of 23 years old.
Tell me what Isaac Olam is doing. I know some of its biodiversity work and species protection. Right?
Yeah. Isaac Olam is it's an Indigenous-led nonprofit educational organization looking at the intersection of biological diversity and cultural diversity.
Right.
And we do that predominantly manifests in supporting the creation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which is a watershed level approach to just, at the end of the day, microeconomics done well.
But that could be part of the global commitment to protect 30% of the land by 2030.
Yeah, we extended the olive branch, so to speak, to the Trudeau government in 2016 when they really put a strong emphasis on meeing their commitments to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. They approached me to help set up a national committee of sort of subject matter experts from within the Indigenous communities, not necessarily politicians, but people who were kind of in the trenches doing the work of nature conservation and building climate resiliency and microeconomics. Mm-hmm. And so this committee eventually became known as the Indigenous Circle of Experts, and we wrote the report called We Rise Together, which was submitted to the co-lead ministers in 2018. Yeah. And this prescribed this new protected areas model, IPCAs. And so Isaac Olam supports First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments who desire to have an IPCA. And we do it through a nonprofit model. And I think, just like I had mentioned with the passing on of teachings from the elders, they didn't charge me consultant rates when I asked questions, you know. But there was a moral responsibility that came with that knowledge to then do something good in the world with it. And so Isaac Olam is one of the ways to discharge that responsibility to the world.
So I know that, I believe you were part of establishing a park along the road to Tofino. Yeah. Is that an ICPA, right?
Well, it's kind of the precursor, one of the precursors. It's called the Ha'ukmin Tribal Park.
Yes.
And there's many other, like the Great Bear Rainforest is another example. We looked at Australian examples, South American, examples in the U.S. of indigenous peoples creating tribal parks. You know, so there's a whole bunch of headwaters to this idea.
So you know
IBC.
how the BC government is currently, with its commitment to stop logging and old growth, in negotiation, discussion, dialogue with 200 First Nations around BC, whose traditional territories cover a whole whack of forest, right?
Yeah.
Could some of that land become Indigenous conservation protected areas, do you think?
Certainly. The key thing is it has to be from the inner volition and self-determination of the nation themselves.
Right, yes.
Like, you can't do IPCAs to somebody.
Right. And in an IPCA, would any kind of logging be allowed, or is it totally nature only?
No, actually, whole diversity is not only permittable, but expected. In fact, it's through that careful relationship with the land that we then cultivate more biodiversity. We're not environmentalists in the kind of conventional sense in that regard, because our people do believe that we have to maintain relationship. And I'll give you a little example. An elder shared with me from the Douglas Treaties, in the Douglas Treaty area where we are. The misinterpretation is that we have the right to hunt deer. But this elder explained to me the nuance is that we have a responsibility to maintain a good relationship with deer.
Right.
And part of that relationship may be to hunt and consume. Do that with respect and dignity.
Yes.
And then another part of that responsibility to maintain relationship is to ensure that the deer has a clean and safe environment to live out its self-determination. And we can learn by observing the deer. We wouldn't put it into cages and
so I've been vegetarian 50 years and vegan-ish for the last 5 years, and I am appalled at the way our white settler civilization treats its farm animals.
My goodness,
the cages. You in the countryside, you might be lovely fields and rolling hills, and you see this big white shed. You think, whatever's going on inside that
scary.
Is scary. It's
it's
not good for the animals, right?
It's a violation of natural law. Sure.
So respect for nature, it's and then in the detail, respect for each individual species within nature is such a new concept for Western capitalist thinking.
Well, you know, it's if you dig deep enough, everybody's indigenous from some part of the world. If you dig deep enough, and there's these simple but powerful teachings. It's when we go around and start trying to tell other people how to live and start taking other people's land, that's when you run into trouble.
In the same way that indigenous peoples got thrown off the land and put into reserves here in Britain, it's called the enclosures. And people throughout the rural areas were thrown off the land because they never owned it. And some landlord would say, I want to have sheep instead, shoved into the cities. And the relationship with the land got broken for many people. And the continuity of story, and it got broken.
To circle back on your question about forestry, New Channel forestry is radically different from conventional logging and deforestation. You have to first have a need in your mind and in your heart, and then you have to understand where, based on that need, what side of the mountain should I go to? Should I go deeper in where it's fresh water, or is it by the ocean where you get salt inundation? Is that appropriate, or is that doable? And my Uncle Joe Martin is still practicing these things. And right now, actually, he's got a group of young apprentices doing traditional dugout canoe building in the forest, in the Haukman Tribal Park. So first this tree had to be harvested. But then all of the main roughing out of the canoes happens on site.
So everything comes out, goes back into the soil, all the cedar, right?
It feeds back into the ecosystem. He uses vegetable oil with his chainsaws so that we're not polluting the site. The connection to the land happens, the education. There's a whole curriculum that goes behind canoe building. So that type of forestry is still acceptable in a tribal park setting. And interestingly, it does also represent an ongoing carbon storage.
Yes, of course.
These monumental works of art, whether it's a totem pole or a canoe, it doesn't go back into the carbon cycle as quickly as dimensional lumber, 2x4s and such. So there's also that element of it.
So I gather you've also been working around Indigenous climate action and work in schools and stuff like that. Where does that all fit in? How does it go?
Okay, so You may recall in 2021 there was the atmospheric river.
I work in climate change full time, so I know that stuff. Yeah, right.
Yeah. The unfortunate thing is that the narrative that won the day, because it took out, well, the flooding of Abbotsford.
Yes.
Took out major infrastructure, basically isolated the West Coast for a period of time with road washout and whatnot. And people, the simple narrative that won the day was, oh, this is climate change and, bad pollution, like this.
Yes, yeah.
But it oversimplified the whole conversation.
Yeah.
I talked to the Sumas peoples, the indigenous peoples of that area, long before the atmospheric river. 100 years actually ago.
Yes.
That whole area in Abbotsford that got flooded, that was a seasonal lake.
I remember learning about that when I looked into that at the time. I thought that should never have been built on in the first place.
That's right, and that's exactly what the Sumas people said. They said, and you know what? It was a double whammy, because they relied upon the sturgeon fishery that was plentiful there at that lake.
Yes.
So number one, they took the farmers took away an economic pillar of the Sumas Nation. And then number two, they put a whole bunch of stuff in there that should not have ever been put in there. And now we're still dealing with the environmental impacts of that, because it's not in the news, but the pollution and the results of that flooding are still
Well, when
happening.
you think that every household's got an oil tank and they got gas and they got a pesticide storage and fertilizer storage,
That's
and it's all being diluted and
That's
washed.
right. And here's the big problem, Guy, is that they said, well, science, we'll fix the problem with science. We need better technology. We need better dikes. We need better pumps. We just, this is climate change's problem, but our science, will overcome. This is just horrible.
That's happened in Britain in the 1800s,
okay,
when they wanted to drain the land to do more productive farming and improve in science. And so they take a wandering creek and they make a rubber straight line dike all the way down. And then they wonder why the flooding's happened. So now actually some of the ministries are going back and teaching the farmers how to put in the berms and the barriers to slow the water down. Then it can soak in and not cause this great flood-off stuff.
Yeah. Too much common sense.
So in the school stuff, you were...
with the climate,
climate action in the schools.
Yeah, and then the other thing is, essentially talking about these things so that people don't get a screwy take of things. The other one that comes from the Chilcotin, they're celebrating their 10-year anniversary, by the way. We're celebrating 40 years, 2024, from 1984 to 2024, 40-year anniversary of the Mears Island Tribal Park in Clayoquot Sound.
Gotcha.
They're celebrating 10 years of their Supreme Court decision, June 26, 2014, on the Supreme Court of Canada decided in favor of the Chilcotin people for Aboriginal title to land. That place where that Aboriginal title is up in the Nemaya Valley region. Chilcotin generally are the peoples.
And this is land outside the reservation.
That's right, outside of the Indian reserves. And they declared in 2014, in October of 2014, they announced the Dasico Tribal Park there. But anyways, the teachings from the elders, they still have elders there, like don't speak much English, really grew up in the land, grew up with more of a traditional life.
Long oral history.
Yeah, and they had a meeting about climate change, and people were talking about the war on climate. And this was being translated from English into their language. And the elders were quite disturbed by this idea of a war on climate.
Yeah.
He said, well, and this is a very typical American thing, right, is to make everything about war. Adversarialness, the war on climate, the good guys and the bad guys. Oversimplified. But what they were really disturbed by is, why would we fight our mother? Our Mother Earth, she's cleansing herself and she's smudging herself. She's not punishing us. She's correcting us with a firm but loving hand. And we don't need to fight Mother Nature. We need to learn to respect her again.
Doesn't that run into a contradictory understanding of the incredible pouring of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels which in the last 200 years, which is the cause of the heat being trapped and the stuff happening?
Yeah.
So
what she's doing is she's implementing corrective measures.
Yeah. But we also need to stop the cause. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah. There's definitely things we need to change.
Yeah.
And that comes from that deep connection and learning.
Yeah.
And how does Mother Nature do it? Well, by golly, couldn't we all live a more prosperous life and have clean air and clean water?
Yeah.
Sounds too idyllic, but when before Europeans arrived here,
Yeah.
this place was teeming with life.
Yes.
The salmon runs, the whale populations. In the prairies, we were talking about Manitoba earlier, I've heard from elders that when the geese migrated, it blackened the sky from horizon to horizon. The deafening sound.
I've read Farley Mowatt's book about that stuff and how, and people
and the bison population.
And how quickly the settlers would just shoot that up and wipe it out entirely. Now, there was one of those birds that fed on mosquitoes.
Okay, yeah.
We've removed the main predator of the mosquito. Hello.
Now start eating mosquitoes. But anyways, point is that it wasn't that long ago. Like, this isn't some utopia that I'm imagining.
Yeah.
Dr. Ron Trosper, if you're interested in economics, Dr. Ron Trosper, Harvard economist, looked at the pre-contact civilizations of the Pacific Northwest and asked a question. How the heck did these guys not only survive but thrive for over 10,000 years in the known archaeological record? That they didn't just avoid the depletion of resources, they actually increased the abundance in the landscapes. And these are the questions we need to ask on how we can go beyond just sustainability to abundability.
So in my reading of history, every single good thing was initially dismissed as a utopian dream, like women getting the vote, or a welfare state, or all the things that we now take for granted as progress. Free public education, free public healthcare. They were fought against. The powers that be at the time didn't want them to happen. So the vision of a full restoration of nature, we should be embracing that 100% fully, because I know 100%. Where there have been ecological restoration projects, nature's like saying, give me a chance, and nature just blossoms. If you just, the writer Tolstoy, he once said in regard to poverty that the rich people are willing to do everything to help the poor except take their boot off their neck. But it's the same with nature. If we take the boot off nature's neck,
Speaking of Tolstoy, have you read My Confession?
No,
It's an essay called My Confession. I highly recommend it. It gets right, I believe, to the core of what's ailing humanity today.
Interesting.
It's not a lack of technology. It's a lack of teachings and understanding. And an understanding of our eternal nature as beings. Because once you give up on your God, whatever that God might be, and you only believe in this finite mortal existence with no real purpose, then you start a life of fear. That's where the bad decisions really come.
Well, my whole reading of capitalism and neoliberalism and those things, it's not a failure of an economic system. It's a failure of human values that lead to that behavior. But if your values say, our number one thing is to maximize our capital, whether it means throwing people out of rental property or exploiting nature, whatever, that's the only thing that matters to us as shareholders, you go fundamentally wrong. Our values need to be, how do we have respect for nature, respect for the world, respect for each other, and build on that foundation. And then you get what I would call a cooperative, loving economy.
So Trosper's little book, it's called Resilience, Reciprocity, and Ecological Economics. The subtitle is Pacific Northwest Sustainability.
We had the 2-minute sign 3 minutes ago.
So we could go on
it's
forever.
It's going to be I know we get distracted. I'd love that this would be an hour and a half. So anyway, look, Eli, thanks so much for doing this and coming in and sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, your upbringing, your teachings with everyone else. This has been the show Change the World. My name's Guy Dauncey, and I hope you join us for a future episode. Thanks for watching.
Cheers.